The scene amidst which Clayton told his last story comes back to me very vividly tonight. He was sitting in the corner of the old settle by the fireplace. Sanderson was next to him, smoking his pipe. Evans was there too, and that marvel among actors, Wish, who is also a modest man. We'd all come down to the Mermaid Club that Saturday morning, except for Clayton, who'd slept there overnight, and that was what gave him his opening. We'd golfed until we could golf no more. We dined, we'd smoked, and we were in that mood of tranquil kindliness when men will suffer a story. So when Clayton began to tell one, we naturally supposed that he was lying. Perhaps he was lying. I got of that. Your judgment will be every bit as good as mine. He certainly began with an air of matter-of-fact anecdote, but I mean, that we thought was only the incurable artifice of the man. I say, he suddenly remarked after a long consideration of the upward rain of sparks from the log that Sanderson had thumped. You know that I was alone here last night? Well, except for the domestics, said Wish. Yeah, who sleep in the other wing, said Clayton. Yeah, well. He pulled at his cigar for some little time, as though he hesitated about making his confidence. And then he said, quite quietly, I caught a ghost. What, caught a ghost, did you? Said Sanderson. Where is it then? And Evans, who admires Clayton very much, said, well, that's wonderful, old boy. Tell us all about it, please. Well, Clayton said that he would in a moment, and he asked Evans to shut the door. Yeah, I'm sure there's no eavesdropping here, of course, he said, but, well, we don't want to risk upsetting the staff with supernatural rumours, do we? There's too much shadow and oak panelling to trifle with that. And this, you see, it wasn't an ordinary ghost. I don't think he'll ever come back. In fact, I'm quite certain that he won't. What, you mean to say you didn't keep him? Said Sanderson. Hadn't a heart to, said Clayton. Well, we all laughed, of course, but Clayton looked aggrieved. Oh, I know what you're thinking, he said, with the flicker of a smile. But no, it was really a ghost. I'm as sure of that as I am that I'm talking to you now. Sanderson drew at his pipe and emitted a thin jet of smoke, more eloquent than any words could have been, but Clayton ignored him. I mean, it's the strangest thing that's ever happened to me. I mean, you know, I've never believed in spooks or anything of the sort before, ever. And then, hey presto, I bag one in the corner of my own club. He stopped to meditate a while and began to pierce a second cigar. Well, you talked to it, did you? This ghost? Asked Wish. Clayton nodded. Yeah, for about an hour. Chatty fellow then, was he? I said, joining the party of sceptics. Well, the poor devil was in the most awful trouble, said Clayton. Sobbing, I suppose, someone asked. Oh, God, yes. Clayton heaved a very realistic sigh at the memory. Yeah, no, he was definitely sobbing, poor fellow. I never realised how wretched a thing a ghost could be. And he hung us up again for a time while he sought for matches in his pocket and lit and warmed his cigar. Well, none of us are in a hurry. I rather took advantage, I'm afraid, he reflected at last. A character, you see, remains just the same character for all that he's been disembodied. We're liable to forget that. You know, people with a certain strength or fixity of purpose will have ghosts of the same strength and fixity of purpose. I mean, most ghosts, if you think about it, must be monomaniacs, obstinate as mules to come back again and again to the same place. But this poor fellow, God, he wasn't like that at all. He suddenly looked up rather queerly, and his eye went round the room. I say it in all kindliness, he said, but the plain truth was that he was weak. You know, even at first glance, I could tell that he was weak. I came upon him in the long passage, you know. His back was towards me, and I saw him first, and right off, I just knew that it was a ghost. Well, I mean, he was transparent and whitish. Through his chest, I could just see the glimmer of the little window at the end of the passage. And you see, it wasn't only his physique that struck me as being weak. It was his whole, his demeanour, you know, his attitude. He just simply looked as though he didn't know what he was doing. You know, one hand was on the panelling and the other kept fluttering to his mouth like that. Well, what sort of physique did he have? Said Sanderson. Lean. Yeah. You know that sort of young man's neck that is two great flutings down the back, like that, and a little meanish head with scrubby hair, rather bad ears, shoulders narrower than the hips, turned down collar, ready-made jacket, trousers baggy and a bit frayed at the heels. That's what I noticed straight off. I came very quietly up the staircase, you see. I was in my slippers and I wasn't carrying a light, so I must have taken him by surprise. But I saw him as soon as I came up. Well, I mean, at first I stopped dead, of course. Well, you would, wouldn't you? I just stood there, taking him in. But you see, I wasn't a bit afraid. No, I suspect that in most of these affairs, one's never nearly as frightened or as excited as one imagines one will be. I mean, I was surprised, certainly, and interested. Well, I mean, very interested, but, you know, I wasn't afraid. I just thought, good heavens, here's a ghost at last. And I never even believed in the blessed things before. I mean, I wasn't on the landing a moment before he sensed that I was there, because he suddenly turned on me rather sharply, and I just saw the face of this drab young man, weak nose, scrubby little moustache, feeble chin. And for an instant, we just stood and regarded one another. Him looking over his shoulder at me, and there he seemed to remember his calling. He turned round, drew himself up, projected his face, raised his arms, and came towards me, emitting a faint, drawn-out woo. Well, now, I just dined, remember, on my own. Now I think I probably had a bottle of champagne and maybe a couple of whiskies, maybe a few more, and I was no more frightened than if I was being assailed by a frog. You don't belong to the club, I said. What are you doing here? I could see him wince. Woo, he went again. Whoa, be hanged, I said. Are you a member? And just to show him what I was made of, I stepped through a corner of him and made to light my candle. Are you a member? I repeated, looking at him sideways. He moved to stand clear of me. He looked absolutely crestfallen. No, he said. No, I'm not a member. I'm a ghost. Well, that doesn't give you the run of the Mermaid Club, I'm afraid. Is there anyone in particular here that you want to see? And doing it as steadily as possible, for fear that he should mistake the carelessness of whiskey for the distraction of fear, I got my candle lit. Come on, speak up, man. What are you doing here? Well, he dropped his hands and he'd stopped wooing by now, and he stood there abashed and awkward, the ghost of a weak, silly, aimless young man. I said, what are you doing here? I'm haunting, he whispered. What? Speak up. I'm haunting. Yeah, well, you've no business to do it here, I said. But I'm a ghost, he said. Yeah, well, that's as maybe, but you haven't any business haunting in this club. This is a private members' club, respectable place. People often stop here with nursemaids and children. Going about in the way that you do, some poor little mite could easily come upon you, be scared out of her wits. I suppose you didn't think of that, did you? No, sir. No, I didn't, he said. No, well, maybe you should have done. I mean, you haven't any claim on this place, have you? You weren't murdered here or anything like that? God, no. No, nothing like that, but well, I thought it's old, it's got this oak panelling and all that. No, I said, I'm sorry, my friend, but your coming here was a mistake, I'm afraid. And if you want a bit of friendly advice, I would vanish pronto. Huh? Don't hang around till the cock crows. Then he just looked embarrassed and said, well, all right, but the fact is, I mean it, I said, it's time to go. Come on, chop, chop. I know, he said, but I can't. You can't? No, sir. Well, why not? Because there's something I've forgotten. Oh, what do you mean? Oh, well, I've been hanging around here since midnight last night, you see. I was hiding in cupboards and that. And I'm flurried, I've never been haunting before, and it seems to put me out. Put you out? Yeah. I can't seem to get back. I've tried several times and it just doesn't come off. There's something I've forgotten and I can't get back. Well, that did rather bowl me over, I must admit. And he looked at me in such an abject way that for the life of me, I couldn't quite keep up the high hectoring vein that I'd adopted. That is queer, I said. And as I spoke, I fancied I heard someone moving about down below. Look, come into my room and tell me more about it, I said. And I tried to take him by the arm. Mistake, of course. I might as well have tried to take hold of the puff of cigar smoke. Here we are, I said when we got to my room. Now, you just sit down and talk to me. It seems that you've got yourself into a bit of a fix, old chap. Well, he said he wouldn't sit down. He'd prefer to flit up and down the room if it was all the same to me. And in a little while, we were deep in a long, serious talk. And after a while, you know, something of those whiskies sort of evaporated out of me. And I began to realise just what a thunderingly weird business I was in. I mean, there he was, this semi-transparent thing, the proper conventional phantom, if you think about it, and completely noiseless except with this rather creepy ghost of a voice that he had, flitting to and fro in that nice old chintz-hung bedroom. I mean, you could see the gleam of the copper candlesticks right through him, and the lights on the brass fender, the corners of the framed engravings on the wall. And there he was telling me all about this wretched life of his that he'd recently ended on Earth, how he'd been killed. Oh, he'd gone down into a basement to look for a gas leak and lit a candle. Well, of course, you know. Said he'd been an English master in a private school when it happened. And the more he talked, the more I just thought, oh, poor fellow. You know, purposeless in life and purposeless out of it. You know, he talked of his father and mother and his schoolmaster, anyone who'd ever been anything to him in the world. None of them had ever valued him properly or understood him, he said. He'd been too sensitive, too nervous, never really had a real friend, never had any success. You know, he'd shirked games, failed examinations, was engaged to be married to another oversensitive person, I can only suppose, when his indiscretion with the gas leak ended everything. And where are you now? I asked him. And you see, he just wasn't at all clear on that point. I mean, the impression he gave was of a sort of a vague intermediate state, a special reserve perhaps for souls too non-existent for anything so positive as either sin or virtue. I don't know. He was much too unobservant to give me any clear idea of what this other side was like. But wherever he was, he seemed to have fallen in with a set of kindred spirits, ghosts of other weak young men, you know, and among these there was a lot of talk about going haunting and things like that. Seriously, they talked about going haunting. You know, they seemed to think haunting was some tremendous adventure, and most of them funked it. Anyway, those are the impressions that he gave me anyway, as he flitted up and down with his thin voice going on about himself, and never a word of clear, firm statement from first to last. You know, he was even thinner and sillier and more pointless than when he'd been alive, I think. Only then, of course, he wouldn't have been in my bedroom. I'd have kicked him out at a very early stage. Of course, Evans broke in, there are plenty of living people like that, and there's just as much chance of their having ghosts as the rest of us. Oh, yeah, said Clayton. But you see, what I suppose gave a sort of point to him was the fact that he did seem within his limits to have found himself out. You know, the mess he'd made of haunting had depressed him something rotten. He'd been told it would be a lark, and here it was, nothing but another failure. He said, and I can quite believe it, that he'd never tried to do anything his whole life that he hadn't made a perfect mess of, and through all the waste of eternity, he thought that he never would. If I'd had a bit more sympathy, perhaps, he said. And then he paused and looked at me. And then he said, strange as it might seem, that nobody had ever given him as much sympathy as I was doing now. Well, I mean, I saw at once what he was getting at, and I determined to head him off at once. All right, call me a brute, but being the only friend and confidant to one of these self-absorbed little fellows, dead or alive, well, sorry, it's not something that I'm cut out to do. Well, try not to brood too much, I said briskly. The thing you've got to do is get out of this fix, and pretty quick sharp. Now, pull yourself together and try again, I said. I can't, he whined. Try it, I said. And so he tried it. How? Asked Sanderson. How did he try? Passes, said Clayton. Passes? Passes? Yeah? It was a complicated series of gestures and passes with the hands, and that's how he'd come in, and that's how he had to get out again. God, what a business it was. But so how could a series of passes, I said. Oh, look, my dear fellow, I don't know the details, do I? All I know is that you do these passes, or he did at any rate, and after what seemed a fearfully long time, you know, he finally got them right, and poof, he disappeared. Well, did you observe them, these passes? Asked Sanderson. Oh, yes, I did. No, I observed them very closely, yes, indeed. He stopped and seemed to think for a moment. It was very queer, he said eventually. There we were, me and this thin, vague ghost in that silent room, you know, in this silent, empty inn, in this silent little Friday night town, not a sound except our own voices and a faint panting when he swung his arms. I can't do it, he kept saying. It's no good, I'll never remember. And at one point he sat down on the little chair at the foot of the bed and he actually began to sob. Ah, now look, pull yourself together, I said. I tried to pat him on the back, and of course my confounded hand went right through him. By that time, you know, well, I must admit, I wasn't nearly so massive as I'd felt on the landing. I got the queerness of it all full on. I remember snatching back my hand out of him with a little shudder and walking over to the dressing table. Now, you've got to pull yourself together now, I said, and try again. And in order to encourage him, I began to try them as well. What, the passes? Said Sanderson. Exactly, said Clayton. But in that case, I said, not quite able to articulate what was worrying me. No, hang on. This is interesting, said Sanderson with his finger in his pipe bowl. You mean to say that this ghost of yours gave away, he did his level best to give away the whole confounded barrier? Yeah. He couldn't, said Wish. Or you'd have gone there too. That's precisely it, I said, finding my elusive idea put into words for me. That is precisely it, said Clayton, with a thoughtful eye upon the fire. And for just a little while there was silence. And he did it at last, did he? Said Sanderson. Yes, at last he pulled it off. I mean, he needed a lot of encouragement. But yeah, no, eventually he did it, rather suddenly, actually. I mean, he was despairing. We had a bit of a scene. Then he got up abruptly, asked me to go through the whole performance myself, slowly, so that he could watch it. I believe he said that if I could see someone else doing it, I could spot what was wrong at once. And so I started doing the thing, of course. And suddenly he calls out, I know. What? I said. I know what the problem is. I can't do it if you're looking. It's been that along. You're looking at me. You put me off. Well, we had a bit of an argument about that as well. I mean, naturally, I wanted to see what he did, but he was actually uncharacteristically firm on this matter. And suddenly, anyway, I'd come over as tired as a dog. Oh, gosh, all right, I said, I won't look at you. And I turned towards the mirror on the wardrobe by the bed. Well, he started off very fast. I tried to follow him by looking in the mirror. Round went his arms and his hands like this. And then with a rush came the last gesture of all. He stood erect, opened his arms like this, stood there, and then he'd gone. He wasn't there anymore. Just disappeared. I wheeled round from the wardrobe and I was completely alone in that room, with two flaring candles and an absolutely staggering mind. I mean, what had happened? Had anything happened? Had I been dreaming? And then, with an absurd note of finality about it, the clock on the landing discovered it was the right moment for striking 1 o'clock. And ping, there I was, sober as a judge and feeling confoundedly queer. He regarded his cigar ash for a moment. And that's it, really. That's what happened. What, and you just went to bed, said Evans. Well, what else could I do? Well, I mean, we all wanted to scoff, of course, but I don't know. There was something in Clayton's manner that hampered us. And about these passes, said Sanderson, do you remember them now? Oh, yeah. Yeah, perfectly well. I believe I could probably do them for you. Go on, then. All right, said Clayton. No, they won't work, said Evans. But if they do, I suggested. You know, Clayton, I'd rather that you didn't do them, said Wish, stretching out his legs. Why? Said Evans. Like, I'd just rather he didn't do them, all right? Said Wish. But surely you don't believe him, I said. Wish glanced at Clayton, who was staring into the fire, weighing something on his mind. I do, actually, yes. More than half, anyway. I do believe him, said Wish. Clayton, I said, you're too good for some of us. Now, come on. Tell Wish here that it's all a tale of cock and bull. And in reply, he stood up, took the middle of the hearthrug and faced me. For a moment, he regarded his feet thoughtfully, and then, for all the rest of the time, his eyes were on the opposite wall with an intent expression. He raised two arms slowly to the level of his eyes and began to gesticulate. Well, we were amused and rather entranced. Now, you see, Sanderson is a Freemason, don't tell him that I told you that, and he followed Clayton's motions with singular interest. Not bad, he said when it was done. Yeah, you've put this together very convincingly, Clayton. It's very clever, but you left out one little detail. I know, said Clayton. This. And he did a queer little twist and writhing and thrust of the hands. That is nearly it, said Sanderson. Yeah, that's one that he couldn't get right, said Clayton. The ghost, I mean. But how do you know about it, said Sanderson. I mean, but most of this business, and particularly how you invented it, I don't understand at all. But just that phase, I do. Those happen to be a series of gestures connected with a certain branch of esoteric masonry, as I suspect you very well know, although how you know it, I've no idea. He reflected still further. Well, look, I don't see any harm in telling you the proper twist. After all, if you know, you know. If you don't, you don't. I know nothing, said Clayton, except what that poor devil told me last night. Well, anyway, said Sanderson, and placed his pipe on the shelf over the fireplace. Then very rapidly, he gesticulated with his hands. What, like this, you mean, Clayton said, repeating. That's it, exactly. With the middle finger like so, precisely. Great. Well, now, golly, said Clayton. Now I can do the whole thing. He stood up before the waning fire and smiled at us all. If I begin, he said. No, please don't begin, said Wish. It's all right, said Evans. Matter's indestructible, don't you know? You don't think any jiggery-pokery of this sort is going to snatch Clayton into the world of the shades, do you, Wish? You may try, Clayton, so far as I'm concerned, until your arms drop off at the wrists. But Wish stood up and put his arms on Clayton's shoulder. Listen, old chap, you've made me half believe in that store of yours somehow. I don't want to see you doing the thing now. Old Wish is genuinely frightened, I said. Yeah, I am frightened, he said. Oh, come on, old man, what? You think he's going to dance a little jig and cross to the other side? There's only one way out of this world, my friend, and Clayton is 30 years from that. But Wish ignored me and stood up. Clayton, please don't do it. With a humorous light in his eyes, Clayton smiled back at him. Wish is right, he said, and all you others are wrong. I shall get to the end of these passes, and as the last swish whistles through the air, presto, I shall go. This hearthrug will be vacant. The room will be blank amazement, and a respectable dressed gentleman of 15 stone will plump into the world of shades. Wish took a step before him, but Clayton held up his hand. No, 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 no. I decline to argue any further. Let the thing be tried. Well, by that time, of course, we were all in a pretty high state of tension. We sat with our eyes absolutely riveted on Clayton. I mean, I at least, with a sort of a tight, stiff feeling about me, as though from the back of my skull to the middle of my thighs, my body had changed to steel. And there, with a gravity that was imperturbably serene, Clayton bowed and swayed and waved his hands and arms before us. And as he drew towards the end, I think that my very teeth were tingling. Now, the last gesture, as I've said, was to swing the arms out wide open with the face held up and do that thing with his hands that Sanderson had showed him. And when at last he swung out to this closing gesture, I think that I probably stopped breathing. I mean, it was ridiculous, of course, but you know the ghost story feeling that you get, don't you? It was after dinner in a queer old shadowy house. I mean, would Clayton, after all? And there he stood, for one stupendous moment, with his arms open and his upturned face assured and bright in the glare of the lamp, and we hung through that moment as if it were an age. And then there was exhaled from all of us something that was half a sigh of relief and half a reassuring no, for visibly Clayton was not going. It was all nonsense. He had told an idle story and carried it almost to conviction, that was all. And then in that moment, the face of Clayton changed. It changed. It changed as a lit house changes when its lights are suddenly extinguished. His eyes were suddenly fixed. His smile was frozen on his lips. And he stood there, still, very gently swaying. And that moment too was an age. Then suddenly chairs were scraping, things were falling, and we were all moving. His knees seemed to give, and he fell forward, and Evans rose and caught him in his arms. I mean, for a moment, I suppose nobody said a single coherent thing. We believed it, but we couldn't believe it. I came out of a muddled stupefaction to find myself kneeling beside Clayton, his vest and shirt torn open, and Sanderson's hand laid on his heart. Well, the simple fact before us could very well wait for our convenience. There was no hurry for us to comprehend it. It lay there for an hour. It lies athwart my memory, black and amazing still to this day. Clayton had indeed passed into that other world that lies so near to and yet so far from our own. He'd gone thither by the only road that mortal man may take. But whether he did indeed pass there by that poor ghost's incantation, or whether he was stricken suddenly by apoplexy in the midst of an idle tale, as the coroner's jury would have us believe, well, that's no matter for my judging. It's just one of those inexplicable riddles that must remain unsolved until the final solution of all things come. All that I know for certain is that in that very moment, that very instant of concluding those passes, my old friend Clayton changed, staggered, and fell down dead.